Cairo, 2019. Within the high-ceilinged halls of the Vault of Ancient Secrets, the dust of time hung suspended in the air. Amidst stones thousands of years old and withered parchments, an absolute silence suddenly shattered like glass. The finger of a 4-year-old boy reached toward the yellowed papyrus behind the protective glass. When those words, which no one expected to hear, spilled from his small lips and froze the air, a cold shiver ran down the spines of the archaeologists present. "It says here that Jesus had a secret friend," Mateo whispered, his voice trembling with the certainty of an adult. At that moment, a grand narrative hidden on the dusty shelves of history, which everyone thought they knew, began to shake with the clear breath of a small child. Mateo Hernández was only 4 years old. His eyes were a warm honey color, shining as if the sun were trapped inside them. His mind flowed like a quiet, deep river, different from other children. When he was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2, it was understood that he read the world through patterns and rhythms, not like the rest of us. This little boy from the warm lands of Mexico possessed an inexplicable passion for ancient symbols. His mother, Elena, was a history professor at the University of Guadalajara. She had thought the complex shapes Mateo scribbled in his notebooks for hours were merely childlike fantasies resembling hieroglyphics. But that March morning, as Cairo's scorching sun seeped through the museum windows, Elena realized that her son was not imagining, he was remembering. The papyrus had been born in the hands of an Oxford team amidst the ruins of a dilapidated Coptic monastery near Nag Hammadi. This weary document, dating back to 380 AD, was a silent cry woven from Aramaic, Coptic, and strange symbols that no one had been able to decipher until that day. Experts had spent months, but could not crack the language of the document. The papyrus chose to whisper its secret not to the professors, but to a small child who entered the room during only the second week of its exhibition. When Mateo stood before the glass, the world went quiet, and the ancient world found its most innocent translator. Elena remembers that moment with a clarity that makes her hands shake even today. Mateo never spoke to strangers. Eye contact was an impassable, invisible wall for him. Yet that day, when he saw the ancient papyrus behind the glass, he rushed forward with excitement, as if recognizing a childhood friend in a crowd. He pressed his small hand against the cold glass. His fingertips seemed to want to touch a soul beyond 1,000 years of dust. He began to murmur in a rhythmic and melodic language his mother had never heard before. The security guard approaching was just about to raise his hand to move them away when Mateo's voice echoed through the high ceilings of the hall. This time the words were in English and ice-cold clear. "Mom, can I read this? It talks about Yeshua ... About his childhood, right?" Dr. Rashid Al-Masri, director of the museum's papyrology department, approached upon hearing this extraordinary commotion. Academic arrogance and childlike curiosity mixed on his face. For a man who had dedicated 30 years of his life to breathing life into silent manuscripts, it was an impossibility that defied logic for a 4-year-old child to solve a text that had left world-class experts speechless. However, he paused when he met Mateo's intense, honey-colored gaze that seemed to see beyond time. "Let the child speak," he told the guard, his voice carrying the authority of the museum. He did not know yet, but that was the moment the dusty pages of history would be rewritten forever. Dr. Al-Masri adjusted his glasses with slightly trembling hands and knelt down to Mateo's height. "What do you see here, little man?" he asked. His voice was less like a professor's and more like an apprentice afraid of bruising a miracle. He pointed to that mysterious section of the papyrus where symbols seemed to come alive and dance under the amber museum light. Mateo tilted his head with that characteristic gesture he made when processing information. He took a deep breath and began to speak with a timeless fluidity that chilled the blood of everyone in the room. "It says here that Yeshua was 6 years old and met a boy named Eliezer in Nazareth. Eliezer was sick and couldn't walk well. The other children were mocking him. Mateo's voice flowed with a calm, almost mechanical peace, as if telling his mother a fairy tale before bed. Elena could hear the sound of her heart thumping violently against her chest. Her son was not just identifying random symbols. He was resurrecting a scene thousands of years old, trapped within that dusty papyrus, as if it had happened yesterday. Dr. Al-Nasri shared disbelieving glances with his colleagues gathered around him. Logic and faith collided in that dim room of the museum. Dr. Samira Najib, a former Coptic expert from the Oxford team, took out her phone with trembling hands and began to record this impossible moment. "This is impossible," she murmured in English, but she couldn't take her eyes off the child's glowing honey eyes for a second. All the boundaries of science were crumbling before the whisper of a 4-year-old boy. Mateo continued. His little finger drew invisible lines on the protective glass, as if following the curves of a secret map only he could see. Yeshua told Eliezer not to be sad. He showed him how to make birds out of mud by the riverbank. "Here is the water symbol." Mateo pointed with his tiny finger to a complex and dark character that experts had labeled as undecipherable in their notes. "And this is the word for flight." Yeshua breathed onto the mud birds, and they took flight as if they were real. That was the first time Eliezer had laughed in a long time. A heavy, breathless silence fell over the room. The words Mateo had just uttered almost perfectly matched a passage from the infancy Gospel of Thomas, an ancient text that a 4-year-old could never have accessed. But what caused a cold shiver to run down Dr. Al-Nasri's spine was not the similarity, but the differences. The specific details Mateo mentioned, the name Eliezer, the sorrowful moment by the river, and the sick child's despair, did not appear in any known sacred text or lost writing. This was a completely new memory that hadn't even made it into the footnotes of history. "How do you know all this, Mateo?" Elena asked. Her voice trembled between the fear she felt as a mother and the admiration she felt as an academic. The child finally lifted his gaze from the yellowed paper. When he slowly raised his head, there was a reflection of an ancient wisdom in his honey eyes, a soul that had been asleep for centuries. Looking directly into his mother's eyes, he said in a whisper, "The letters tell me, Mom. I can hear them speaking. I have always been able to hear them." Dr. Najib approached, breathless with excitement. She quickly scrolled through high-resolution photos on her tablet. "Mateo," she said, her voice shaking as she pointed to a character. "This symbol in the top corner that has baffled the world's best linguists for months. Can you tell me what it means?" The child didn't hesitate for a second. It was as natural as saying his own name. "This is the witness symbol. It means someone saw what happened with their own eyes, and wrote it so it would never be forgotten, as if carving it into a heart." This explanation shattered all professional walls in the room. Dr. Al-Nasri made a wild decision that brushed aside all the rigid protocols the museum had followed for decades. He ordered the papyrus to be brought immediately to a special research room, where Mateo could get close enough to touch it without the barrier of glass. Turning to the tense curator who reminded him of security rules, he shouted with an authoritative voice, "If this child can read in seconds what we couldn't solve in 6 months, we must document every syllable that comes out of his mouth." As Elena signed the authorization forms, the pen was slipping through her fingers. She felt that she was signing not just a document, but the fate of her son and history itself. 20 minutes later, in that sterile room where the texture of time was protected under special lights, Mateo sat before the ancient relics spread out on a padded table like a small giant. The papyrus, carrying the weight of 16 centuries, seemed to breathe with its irregular edges and frayed texture. In some places, the ink was as pale as a completely erased memory. In others, it was surprisingly sharp, as if written in a hurry just last night. Mateo reached out curiously, but Dr. Najib stopped him gently, like a priestess afraid of damaging a sacred object. "We can't touch the papyrus directly, sweetie, but you can look as closely as you want." The boy nodded silently and leaned over the document. His eyes moved from left to right, diving into the depths of the lines at a speed that seemed impossible for his age. For 3 whole minutes, the only thing heard in the room was the mechanical hum of the ventilation and the held breaths of the scientists. High-resolution cameras mounted on the ceiling and corners were recording this most peculiar moment in history, second by second. Then Mateo started speaking again. The words that spilled out were so heavy and real that Elena felt her knees buckle, and she collapsed into the first chair she found. "This papyrus was written by a man named Tobías," Mateo said, as if the man were standing right next to him. "He was the older brother of Eliezer, that little boy who couldn't walk well. Tobías was 16 when he met Yeshua. Here, his name is written right here." He pointed to a cluster of symbols in the bottom right corner that no one had ever imagined could be a signature. Mateo's voice deepened, his gaze sinking into the shadows of 1,000 years ago. "Tobías wrote this exactly 53 years after Yeshua left this world. He was afraid of being killed for telling the truth. So he hid this writing in silence, in the depths of that monastery, where no one would find it." At this point, the tension between Mateo's childlike innocence and the weight of a 1,000-year-old conspiracy reaches its peak. I continue the story by blending the horror and admiration created by this discovery. The key to the lost code Dr. Al-Masri was taking frantic notes as if racing against time. The scratching of the pen in his notebook was the only sound in the room. "What truth, Mateo? What was Tobías so afraid of that he would bury these words under the ground?" The boy continued to speak in that monotonous and spiritual tone he adopted when in a deep trance. "Tobías saw moments no one else saw, the things Yeshua did when he thought he was alone. But Tobías followed him like a shadow, because he had only one goal. He wanted to understand how he healed his brother Eliezer, the formula of that miracle. The air in the room grew heavy, like before a storm charged with electricity. Dr. Najib brought her face very close to the papyrus, trying to match Mateo's words with the scraps in her own mind. "My God," she whispered in her native tongue. "There really is a root here that could be translated as secretly watching or following. And this sequence, yes, it could be a proper name." She turned to Dr. Al-Masri with eyes wide open. Her face was white as lime. "This child is reading the points we just dismissed as decorative damage or decay. This is scientifically impossible, but it's happening right before my eyes." Mateo looked up at that exact moment. With his gaze, he uttered that sentence that would be sealed in the souls of everyone present. Tobías wrote that Yeshua whispered a secret to him. He told him where to find something very important at the heart of the world. And that thing is still waiting there. During the next 4 hours, the museum transformed into the strangest laboratory in modern history. An elite team of 12 experts compared every syllable Mateo uttered with global databases. The results left them breathless. The boy was not only cracking Aramaic and Coptic, he was translating that third writing system created by Tobías himself, a special code no linguist had ever seen before, as if he held a key. This was a cipher hidden within history, and the key was in the hands of a 4-year-old Mexican boy. Elena, watching her son, felt the collision of 2 opposite emotions in her chest. A mother's priceless pride and a sinister horror seeping into the depths of her soul. ... Mateo showed not the slightest sign of fatigue. On the contrary, his mind, usually somewhat detached from the world and chasing patterns, seemed to have finally discovered its true purpose of existence, in a state of focus more serene and smooth than ever before. The secrets within the ancient ink seemed to transform into living beings in the child's mind. Here Tobías tells of the day he followed Yeshua to a distant cave in the hills of Nazareth. The boy continued. His little finger pointed to that dense section of the papyrus where the symbols became small and cramped like a whisper. making it hard to even breathe. This was a hidden sanctuary where Yeshua went to escape the crowds, to talk to the sky and take refuge within himself at times when no one saw. Dr. Al-Masri leaned in carefully, like an explorer kneeling before a treasure map. A cave? Well, does the papyrus indicate exactly where this place is? Mateo shook his head slowly. His voice was smooth, less like a navigation device, and more like an ancient echo. Tobías wrote, "One must walk exactly 2,400 steps north from the main well in Nazareth, up the stony path where 3 olive trees form a triangle. The mouth of the cave is hidden behind a giant heart-shaped rock, tucked away behind time." The room erupted with murmurs of disbelief and wonder. Dr. Najib frantically attacked her laptop keys, bringing archaeological layers of ancient Nazareth onto her screen. This is an incredible certainty," she said, her fingers flying over the keyboard in excitement. "If these descriptions are real, it means we are talking about a virgin land that has not been stepped on for thousands of years, having no trace even on official archaeological maps." Dr. Al-Masri shook his head, trying to process this miracle that pushed the boundaries of his logic. Mateo ... Does the papyrus say what is hidden inside that cave? What exactly did Tobías witness there in the darkness? Mateo fell into silence for a moment. His gaze swept over the last lines of the document, over those shadowy symbols that time had almost completely erased. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was deeper, more ancient, as if echoing from a frequency that did not belong to this world. Tobías wrote that Yeshua whispered a secret to him. He taught him where to find something priceless, and that relic is still there, waiting in the darkness of the cave. The child took a pause long enough to stop time in the room. There was something else Yeshua left there, a silent object wrapped in linen. Tobías didn't dare touch it because he felt the weight of the sacred. But he noted the location exactly, at the very bottom of the cave, 7 steps from the entrance, buried under a flat stone. It was too late when Elena noticed the tears trickling down her cheeks. Her 4-year-old son had laid before them precise coordinates for a lost site that could shake the foundations of religious history. A mother's compassion and a historian's horror nodded in Elena's heart. However, the secret warning at the end of the text took everything to a much more sinister dimension. Mateo pointed to those nearly invisible final symbols at the very bottom corner of the papyrus, which could only be noticed at a certain light angle. Tobías placed a seal, Mateo said. He said that the only person who could read the words without being taught would be worthy of finding the relic hidden by Yeshua. The child looked up at Dr. Al-Masri. The intensity in his gaze shattered all the composure the elderly archaeologist had accumulated throughout his life. Mateo whispered as if delivering a secret to its owner after 1,000 years. "I think Tobías wrote these lines all those centuries ago exactly for me." The news spread like a spark, falling into a dry forest, burning and destroying everything in its path. In less than 24 hours, the face of that little Mexican boy who solved a 1,000-year-old mystery with his fingertips became the agenda in every monastery, every laboratory, and every kitchen from Tokyo to New York, from the cold studios of CNN to the dignified buildings of the BBC. Everyone was talking about Mateo. The hotel where the Hernández family had taken refuge was no longer a peaceful resting place, but a giant media carnival where helicopters pounded the sky and hundreds of cameras watched the windows like predators. The world was impatient to throw stones into the clear lake of Mateo's mind. Elena made the heaviest signature of her life on her soul. She silenced the 237th call on her mobile phone without looking at the screen, with a rejection. When the device's light went out, the noise in the room was replaced by a sacred silence. She huddled close to Mateo, inhaled his scent that was a bit detached from the world, but at peace with heaven, and whispered in his ear like a secret only the two of them knew. "We will find that cave, Mateo. We will complete that sentence that Tobías left unfinished." when Roberto flew from the warm lands of Mexico into the sinister chaos of Cairo, a father's protective anxiety and a husband's admiration were mixed on his face. His civil engineer mind did not like uncertainties. "Are you sure, Elena?" he asked, unable to hide the tremor in his voice. "We don't know what awaits us there, or if we can protect Mateo under this burden." Elena saw not the fatigue of years in her husband's eyes, but a mother's unshakable faith. For years they said he was lacking, that he was different, Roberto. Doctors put him in a box, teachers drew boundaries. But now for the first time I see that Mateo is not a mistake. He is an answer. Our son was chosen, Roberto. I don't care who chose him. I will just be the hand that clears the stones from his path. The theories on paper gave way to the dust of Jerusalem's ancient streets and the tense whispers in the corridors of the Israel Antiquities Department. When Dr. Al-Masri formed that emergency team of 15 elite souls to end history's greatest game of hide-and-seek, science had turned into a matter of faith. Dr. Najib insisted that Mateo, with his small body, be the compass of this giant expedition. "Without that child," she said, her voice carrying the icy certainty of academia, "the coordinates remain only dots on a blind man's fingertips. He is the only key behind the locked door." At the end of 3 days, when they arrived in Nazareth, the sky looked like liquid gold, emitting vibrations under a scorching sun. The modern city was spread over the childhood footsteps of Jesus like a layer. The group first took refuge in the heart of tradition and faith, the Church of the Annunciation, where Gabriel was said to have whispered that great news to Mary. From there, they began to calculate that famous 2,400 steps north, a count that Tobías had entrusted to the soil 16 centuries ago. Time was like a melting road under their feet. Mateo held his mother's warm hand with a peace completely cleansed from that media storm, flashes, and helicopter noise they left behind. With his blue hat to protect him from the sun, and his small boots, he raised tiny clouds with every step on the dusty road. When they reached that mathematically calculated point, a deep silence and disappointment prevailed in the team. Around them were only soulless rocks, scorched bushes, and that silence of the desert which was heavier than deafness. There was no cave in sight, only drought. But then Mateo suddenly let go of Elena's secure paw. As if a whisper from the depths of the soil were calling his name, he walked toward the east with determined steps. "Trees," he said simply. His voice was as light as a feather, but as sharp as a rock. He pointed with his finger to 3 ancient olive trees that had twisted through the centuries, standing as if telling stories to each other and forming an almost perfect triangle. Despite the hot weather, Dr. Al-Masri felt that age-old shiver on his spine again. "My God," he whispered against the wind. The papyrus. The papyrus wasn't lying. The team followed that little boy, guided by an instinct no one could explain, moving toward the trees as if flying under the sun. And at that exact point, where time stood still, they saw it. A massive heart-shaped rock, partially hidden by wind-blown sands and stubborn vegetation. Every curve was identical to that description. Tobías had cried with his ink 16 centuries ago. Moving that giant mass was like forcing a rusty lock of history. The team sweated through specialized pulleys, ropes, and a relentless 3-hour struggle to move this 800-kilogram silent sentinel. When the rock finally groaned and slipped from its place, a dark opening wide enough for an adult to crawl through was revealed behind it. The air leaking out of the cave was ice cold, as if the absolute silence of centuries had soaked into the scent of the soil and stone. Drifting out, Dr. Al-Masri, his hand trembling slightly, fired up his powerful flashlight and shone the light into that ancient void. The walls were made of natural limestone, polished by the patient hands of moisture and time. As the beam of light seeped into the depths of the cave, into the heart of the unknown, they encountered a sight that knotted the breath of everyone present. Hundreds, thousands of engravings carved into the walls. Some were so tiny and delicate that they looked as if they were etched into the stone, not by human hands, but by a soul-as whisper. "This is impossible," Dr. Najib murmured, her voice trembling on the edge of excitement and fear. "These engravings, they are the same age as the papyrus, maybe much older. It's as if the walls are speaking." Mateo let go of the safe harbor between his mother's fingers and took his first step into the ice-cold breath of the cave. "I have to go inside," he said. His voice resembled that sinister silence in the middle of a storm. When that pure panic every mother would recognize appeared in Elena's eyes, her gaze searched for Roberto. However, Dr. Almasri intervened by kneeling before Mateo. "Are you sure, little man? It might be darker inside than you think." The child shook his head, trusting the torch burning in his mind. "The words, they are calling me. I can hear them from here, even from the outside." After equipping Mateo with a small helmet light and a rope harness for his safety, the team allowed him to open the door to history. First Mateo, then Dr. Almasri, Elena, and 2 more archaeologists. They seeped into the darkness, swallowing the dust of centuries. The cave was much more magnificent than its misleading entrance. The ceiling reached 3 meters in some places, the walls echoing the whispers of history. The ground beneath their feet was hard and virgin, like a shroud that had been waiting for 1,000 years not to be stepped on. Mateo walked his steps as if performing a ritual, following that invisible instruction in the papyrus. He walked exactly 7 steps from the entrance and stood before a flat stone buried in the ground, its surface worn by time. Pointing down with his finger, he simply said, "Here." The archaeologists began to excavate around the stone with the precision of a surgeon. Every centimeter, every grain of dust was being recorded by cameras and sensitive devices. When they finally lifted that 60 by 40 centimeter slab with their breaths held, all movement in the room stopped. Beneath the stone was a flawless cavity carved directly into living rock. And inside that cavity, protected by 2,000 years of absolute darkness, lay a silent object wrapped in a cloth that appeared once to have been white linen, but was now succumbed to time. Dr. Najib lifted the package with extremely careful, gloved hands, as if afraid to hurt a bird's life. Her trembling could no longer be hidden. The weight in her palm was only a few grams, but the burden she felt was worth thousands of years. As she slowly parted the cloth under the flickering lights of the torches, the silence in the cave grew so intense it was as if the air turned into a solid mass of glass. Coming out from the ancient linen fibers was a tiny roll of parchment, miraculously preserved thanks to the dry and stable breath of the cave. The moment Elena saw the outer surface of the parchment, she covered her mouth with her hands. A sob knotted in her throat. Even with her academic knowledge, she could recognize that Aramaic character carved on the outside of the parchment like a seal, witnessing. Mateo reached out for the parchment with a haste he had never shown before. His voice echoed like a divine command rather than a childlike request. "I have to read it, Mom, ... I have to read those last words written by Yeshua himself." The parchment was transported to the conservation laboratory of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem under the highest security measures. For 2 whole days, experts made a superhuman effort to stabilize the document, which carried the weariness of centuries, without damaging a single piece. When the results of the carbon-14 tests hit the screens, the foundations of biblical archaeology moved. The parchment was dated back to 33 AD, the dark period when Jesus was accepted to have left this world, with an error margin of only 5 years. But the greatest battle was taking place in Mateo's small mind. Since they came out of the cave, the boy had been longing for sleep. Elena would find him every night sitting on the hotel bed, drawing complex symbols in his notebook, as if in a trance. Mateo's gaze was as if he carried a world burden that was too heavy for the shoulders of a 4-year-old child. "The words don't stop talking to me, Mom," he whispered, his sun-colored eyes filled with tears. "Yeshua ... He is very sad. He wants people to know that secret truth now. When the parchment was finally opened in that sterile room under maximum security, the world stood before a handful of select people. The document, spread on a specially designed glass table, stretched like a lost vein of history with its 92-centimeter length. The ink was pitch black and had a terrifying clarity that defied centuries. It had wrapped around both surfaces of the parchment like a spiderweb. The writing was ancient Aramaic, but in between were interspersed those same foreign symbols that whispered in Tobías' papyrus and on the limestone walls of the cave, like a seal. When Dr. Al-Masri allowed Mateo to approach, all the hum of scientific devices in the room ceased. The child stroked his finger over that black ink as if caressing a memory and began to translate aloud. What he said was shocking enough to cause some of the experts in the room to make the sign of the cross with an ancient reflex. Yeshua Barasef. I carved these words into my heart in the 30th winter of my life, feeling my shadow in this world shortening. I saw what is to come, that inevitable end. My strength is not enough to change it, but I can leave a witness about who I really am and what I came to sow in these lands that history cannot forget. The translation continued over long hours where the flow of time was lost. As Mateo read those childhood passages that did not appear in any history book, his voice hung in the damp air of the room. Yeshua's deep confusion while discovering those uncontrollable abilities within him. The cold fear he felt being different from others as a child. And the sleepless nights he spent on the stones in that dark cave, trying to understand why only he could perform the miracles that others found impossible. All were coming alive with Mateo's clear voice. When they reached that middle part of the parchment that changed everything, an invisible fault line split between the religious members in the room. As Mateo continued to read, a heart-wrenching contrast formed between the childlike voice and the spilling words of massive weight. My worldly father Joseph taught me that love is more sacred than law, and the heart more sacred than paper, Mateo whispered. When the rabbis spoke to me about the weight of sin and the rules of purity, I saw in their eyes only fear and a hunger for control. The truth I came to whisper to the world was simple. We are all divine. We all carry that same ancient light shining in my chest today. I did not come to be worshipped. I came to show you how to worship that secret holiness already existing within each of you. How to love yourselves. Haham Mose Goldstein, the religious advisor of the project, jumped out of his chair as if he had received a physical slap. This is clearly heresy. He shouted, his voice echoing through the sterile glass of the laboratory. This document, if real, stabs a dagger into the heart of 2,000 years of Christian and Jewish doctrine. It destroys all the foundations of faith. However, Dr. Najib, without taking her eyes off that sacred ink, calmly challenged the rabbi's anger. Or Mose. This document brings to light that real truth, that suppressed transparent voice that doctrine has hidden from the world for 2,000 years. Scientific data is now beyond discussion. This parchment is authentic and written with the exact warmth of those dark days. Mateo, completely oblivious to that academic and religious storm erupting around him, continued to move his finger along the lines. What spilled from his lips were those forbidden teachings pruned away from official gospels centuries ago. What they told resembled an ancient mysticism that emphasized the infinity of the soul rather than the rigid molds of traditional religions. The forgotten philosophy that God was not on a throne, but in a child's laughter or inside a stone. As Mateo approached the end of the parchment, he reached that passage that shook everything to its core. I have hidden 3 separate testimonies for future generations to find when they are ready, the child whispered. His voice no longer belonged to this century, echoing like a testament from 2,000 years ago. The first is here, in this cave where I shared my loneliness and learned to talk to the sky. The second is in the cool heart of those turbulent waters on which I once walked. The third is On that hill where I will deliver my last breath to the wind. When the existence of two more sacred relics written by Jesus himself came to light, the world entered a relentless, dark, and chaotic race against time within seconds. Religious giants from all over the world issued harsh declarations demanding the parchment be declared fake and immediately destroyed. The Vatican sent its most effective diplomats to the laboratory door. Islamic and Jewish opinion leaders expressed their deep concern about the cracking of the unshakable laws of faith. However, Dr. al-Masri, with the stubborn honor of a scientist, refused to stop the research. Historical truth cannot be suppressed just because it disturbs someone. He cried out at that famous press conference broadcast live in 52 countries. Truth is too bright to be hidden. Mateo spent days leaning over the parchment, searching for those secret codes, whispering the location of the second testimony. Under the waters on which I once walked, he repeated over and over, his fingers drawing complex, fluid maps in his notebook. Elena, with motherly protectiveness and historian's ambition, stayed up at her laptop, comparing sacred texts with satellite images and geographic data like a surgeon. And finally she found it, the Sea of Galilee. Those ancient waters where Jesus was rumored to have walked on stormy waves, also known as Lake Tiberias. Secrets were now watching the world from under the water. But the surface area of the sea is 166 square kilometers, Roberto, said her husband's voice. This was the last fortress of rational mind against the storm of faith. With coordinates drawn in ink, we are looking for a needle at the bottom of a huge lake. We have no single concrete evidence that we will find something specific there. Mateo did not respond to his father's technical concern with words. Instead, he pointed to a drawing on the parchment that no one had cared about until then, which stood faint like a shadow. This was a rough but soul-filled map depicting the eastern shores of the Sea of Galilee, near the present city of Kursi, stamped like a seal struck on stone with an X mark. 3 days later, the team arrived at those shores in northern Israel, where history was covered by waters. The most skillful divers of underwater archaeology were there to accompany this quiet expedition. The Sea of Galilee might appear like a freshwater lake with its 43-meter depth. However, the intense layer of sediment at the bottom was cruel enough to turn vision into a blind man's world. According to those mysterious coordinates Mateo extracted from between the lines of the parchment, the second testimony should lie exactly 200 meters from the shore, in the heart of a darkness about 25 meters deep. The first dive ended with only a cold and blurry void, the second and third as well. At the end of that intense, annoying 6-day search, the team's hope began to cool like the waters of the lake. However, Mateo was like an unshakable rock. Every morning, sitting by the lake with his feet in those cool waters, he waited as if for a whisper, a sign that would come from 1,000 years ago. Elena watched him from a distance with a silent horror. Had she pushed her son far beyond his capacity? Would this ancient obsession swallow and destroy the peace of the Hernández family like a vortex? In the evening of the 7th day, while the sun left its last copper-colored gleams over the waters of the Sea of Galilee, that moment happened where logic ended and an ancient call began. Mateo suddenly broke his days-long silent waiting and stood up. His gaze was locked not on the horizon of the lake, but directly into the depths of the water. His steps were unwavering. While Elena's cry, "Mateo, stop!" echoed in the coolness of the evening, the child had already surrendered to the cold lap of the waters. The water rose to his waist, then to his chest. With every step, an invisible hand seemed to pull him down from below. Just as Elena was about to jump after him, Mateo stopped. Standing in the middle of the water, illuminated like a saint by the light of the setting sun, he pointed his finger down. "Right here," he said, with his composure that exceeded human boundaries. "Right here, just below the darkness." Divers frantically rushed to that point, marked by Mateo like a compass. The voice coming from the radio frequency carried a shock that shook that moment where history held its breath. Sonar caught something. This cannot be a natural formation. A stone casing buried in a meter of sediment, sealed ... As if a coffin is waiting in that depth, an artificial structure is watching us. Impossibility was about to rise from the waters of Galilee as a reality. Taking out that black basalt box turned into a heavy 48-hour surgical procedure on history's shoulders. Born from Galilee's volcanic past, that casing carved from stone darker than night had resisted the pressure of centuries with its 35-centimeter body. The lid, sealed with that enchanted mixture of resin and beeswax, had not shared the air it kept inside for 2,000 years with anyone. That cold and rough texture of basalt, like a heart beating underground, held within it the fate of the Hernández family and all of humanity. When that basalt casing finally met the sunlight and was laid on a protective table, the inscription standing on it like a seal came to light. Those same foreign and strange symbols living in Mateo's mind. The boy, with his hair still damp from the lake waters and his trembling shoulders, approached the table. He did not hesitate. His voice rose as if wiping away the dust of centuries. For that person who can listen to the silent words, this is the second testimony of Yeshua Bar Yosef. It was left in these depths where I showed how faith could conquer the impossible. Elena clung tightly to her son, with tears trickling down her cheeks, as if clinging to something sacred. Her 4-year-old son had become the greatest witness of history. She had now verified with her soul that this box had been placed by Yeshua himself into the heart of the waters. In the laboratory in Jerusalem, when the moment came to break the seal of the basalt, the room fell into silence. When that ancient lid finally opened, the air seeping out smelled of myrrh and spices. These were sacred scents used in ancient times to protect the most precious documents and defy time. 2,000-year-old air mixed like a storm into the sterile scent of the modern laboratory. Inside was another parchment wrapped in silks dyed purple, a symbol of royalty and wealth. However, what took everyone's breath away in the room was another object standing right next to the fabric. A tiny bird figure carved out of wood, darkened by time and darkness. Like a mute twin of those birds, Yeshua made of mud and flew into the sky to make his sick friend Eliezer laugh, as described in the first parchment. It looked at the Hernández family. Mateo reached out his trembling fingers for the blackened wooden bird and held it as delicately as a sparrow. The moment his fingertips touched that ancient surface, the childless body tensed like a bow, and his eyelids closed as if wanting to open into another universe. "I can see," he whispered. His voice was not breathing modern oxygen, but the sandy wind of the desert. "I am watching Yeshua carve this bird. He is sitting by the lake in a pitch-black night. Tears are mixing with the waters. He is afraid of that great darkness to come, but he knows his soul must pay this price, that it is the only way." Elena wanted to throw herself forward uncontrollably. However, Dr. Almasri stopped her with that sharp look, indicating that the most intimate moment of history should not be interfered with. Something extraordinary, timeless was happening. For 3 eternal minutes, Mateo remained frozen like a statue, eyes closed, holding the wooden bird tightly. When he finally opened his eyes, the tears spilling from his honey eyes left silvery traces on his cheeks. "He knew my future, right from the beginning," he said in a broken voice seeped through sobs. Yeshua wrote these lines, imagining that someone like me would come along one day. For someone who can read without needing anyone's teaching, whose mind works not with the rules of this world, but with the rhythm of patterns. He said that only such a mind could see that actual truth, undistorted by the rusty hands of doctrines and rigid institutions, as it is. The second parchment opened with an even more shocking and deep explanation than the first. The lines within carried teachings on compassion, unconditional forgiveness, and the source of human suffering, miraculously resembling those serene philosophies of Buddhist wisdom. This was the first and greatest proof of what Yeshua had gathered in his satchel in the ancient paths of the East during those lost years that historians had debated for centuries. The last lines of the parchment burned through the cold air of the laboratory like a testament written in blood. The third and final testimony. In that place where everything turns into an end for me and a new beginning for the world. It waits in the shadow of that hard rock where my last blood dripped. I have left there those most intimate words that will make humanity forget everything it knows about death, suffering, and my purpose for existing. Only the person who follows the first two lights will be worthy of illuminating this final darkness. Mateo turned to Elena with an unshakable determination glowing like a coal never seen before in his gaze. His voice was no longer that of a child, but a command coming from beyond centuries. We must go to Jerusalem. Mom... To Golgotha. We must climb that hill where he left his last breath. Jerusalem met the team with a heart of storm, faith, and anger. The front of that sacred church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Yeshua was crucified and buried according to Christian tradition, had turned into a Judgment Day square. Thousands of protesters were split in two, with shouts that shook the walls. On one side, those greeting Mateo as a messenger descended from heaven. On the other, those cursing him as a wicked person touching sacredness. Archaeologists moved in the shadow of special forces between the security walls woven by the Israeli police. They slipped through that massive door where history's greatest tragedy and most magnificent mystery took place. Calvary, also known as Golgotha. Today it consisted of only a small, rocky hill imprisoned inside a giant cathedral. Mateo, ignoring the gold-gilded decorations around him, those heavy smells of incense accumulated over centuries, and all the splendor coming from human hands as if they didn't exist, walked directly toward that naked sacred rock. He knelt with a dervish's silence and rested his palm against that 1,000-year-old cold stone. Here, he said, his voice like a seal echoing in the high domes of the church, exactly at the heart of this rock, where everything ended and began. An excavation in the heart of the Christian world triggered not a diplomatic crisis, but practically a faith earthquake. After 3 days of breath-holding negotiations, limited permission was given for ground-penetrating radar technology to roam over that sacred surface. The data hitting the screens created a mute shock. Exactly 3.5 meters below the Golgotha rock, an artificial room was detected that appeared in no ancient plan, no secret archive of the church. Reaching there was scientifically impossible without a massive destruction. However, Mateo intervened with that clear consciousness piercing the centuries. Yeshua didn't hide the room in the heart of the rock. He opened a small breath path from outside. Sealed, dusty, but still waiting there. At the place the child pointed to with his finger, hidden under layers of construction, plaster, and renovation heaps of centuries, that narrow opening sealed in the outer wall of the church was found. When the passage finally opened, Elena made the sharpest and most painful decision of her life. Despite Roberto's howling objections, she declared with an unshakable maternal authority in her voice, "Only Mateo can enter. This journey was designed for him from the beginning. As a mother or a scientist, I can no longer stand in his way." The small boy slipped down that dark, narrow tunnel where the camera on his helmet was the only window opening to the world. Outside, experts following live images from dozens of screens, heads of state, and the whole world went silent at the same time. That hidden room under Golgotha was only a stone cell of 2 square meters, carved directly into the soul of the rock. At the center stood a stone altar carrying the splendor of simplicity, and upon it a chest made of cedar wood, preserved defying time. Mateo, with hands that no longer trembled, as if delivering a relic to its owner, parted the lid. Inside was a parchment, history's final whisper, and beside it a tiny glass bottle containing a dark and ancient liquid that subsequent analysis would confirm as 2,000-year-old actual human blood. Mateo's voice echoed like a hymn on the cold stone walls of the church and in the crackle of speakers. reading that last breath left to the world by Jesus. To the brother who will read this, I did not come to build new religions or to split humanity into the saved and damned. I came only to remind you that each of you are the children of the divine. The kingdom of God is not in magnificent temples or in a distant heaven. It is in that most secluded, most pure corner of every human heart. I leave my blood here, not as a sacrifice erasing sins, but as proof that I could choose love even in the greatest suffering. I wish that these words shatter those thick walls built by people in my name and unite what should never have been separated, human to human. When Mateo came out of the tunnel, he was not that old Mateo. His honey eyes carried not the crushing weight of a misunderstood mission, but the serenity of a soul that had completed its duty. As Elena hugged her son before history and all of humanity, that moment was recorded not just as a discovery, but as a mother reuniting with her son. The three ancient parchments finally took their place in the dim and protected halls of the Israel Museum. Millions of people flocked there to witness the breaking of 1,000-year silence. Religious institutions were shaken. Some met this reality with silent acceptance, while others clung to their doctrines and rejected it. But no one could bury the cold and unquestionable evidence of science back into the depths of history. 5 years later, Mateo Hernández is 9 years old, living a serene life under the warm sun of Guadalajara. He no longer talks about those strange symbols, nor brings messages from Yeshua. His autism is still a part of him, his way of perceiving the world is still different. But now the world knows that some minds are not broken. On the contrary, they are specially designed to see truths that others are blind to. On some quiet nights, Elena still finds Mateo watching the stars in front of the window. Mateo smiles peacefully, as if sharing a secret from the sky with an ancient friend who lived 2,000 years ago. Tobías's legacy, which waited under the ground for centuries, is finally complete. Silent words have been heard, and truth, as it always should have been, is finally free. Guadalajara, 2029. When the orange sunsets of Mexico hit the garden of the Hernández family, the world was no longer the old world. Mateo, 9 years old, was walking peacefully on the bank of that quiet river that turned into himself. Now he had no burden of sealed papyri or ancient languages on his shoulders, only a child's right to explore the world. Ava was watching her son from the veranda, writing her final notes in an old notebook. The world continued to discuss the 3 discovered parchments. Theologians were reinterpreting doctrines. Historians were establishing new chairs on Yeshua's lost years. But for Eva, the greatest discovery was not what was written in the parchments, but that invisible power her son found during this process. Mateo's autism, once a symbol of an obstructed life, was now recognized as the key to a window humanity couldn't see. Roberto had made it a tradition to study star maps with Mateo amidst engineering projects. Anxiety had been replaced by a deep respect. Mateo would sometimes look at the sky and say, "Light is everywhere." Dad, murmuring that last sentence Yeshua left on his parchment with the rhythm of his own life. In a corner of that myrrh-scented hall in the Israel Museum, the wooden bird figure still waits with its wings open to eternity. On the plaque beneath it now reads not just archaeological data, but this sentence: when faith conquers the impossible, truth speaks with the voice of innocence. Tobías's testament found life in the honey eyes of a child, and history was rewritten for the first time, not by a conqueror, but by a 4-year-old child who knew how to listen silently.